session with Pio. We were talking about securing your data in Azure. So how Pio, how are you doing today, Pio?
Thank you. I'm good. I'm good as Aro.
Yeah.
Uh,
Just
the,
basic thing. What and just in 2 lines, what you're sharing about data in Azure? What are you talking about in this session?
yeah. So tonight we're gonna talk about securing your data in Azure SQL. We're gonna talk about the capabilities that we have in Azure SQL in securing your data, and point out some items that you should be aware of, some configuration that you should be take care of when deploying your databases in the cloud.
Oh,
So
that
that's the
looks very
focus for tonight.
exciting. Yeah. Wow, there's like a so the stage is all yours, Pio.
All right, let me just grab and share. Let me just get ready here and then we can start. All right, I believe you can see my screen now. All right.
Yes, Pio. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Yeah. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Well, let's go and start with our first session. Azure SQL, securing your data in Azure SQL. I'm Pio Balistoy. I'm a lead Microsoft Data Platform consultant for PTN Services. I've been doing SQL Server for 18 years now. Uh, I started with SQL 6.5 until now, Azure SQL. Like Aro said, I'm one of the organizers for Singapore Data Platform User Group. So if you have any questions about data, about SQL Server, about SQL, if you or you just want to connect after the session, or if you have any questions about the session, you can reach me through the social media channels that are on your screen right now. And then enough about me. Let's tonight we're gonna talk about securing your data with Azure SQL. If you registered for the event on the first day and you saw the announcement when we announced episode 4, you might be wondering why I am the one speaking, because we originally have Prince Kerr slated for session 1, talking about securing your data in Azure, the same topic. But unfortunately, he had some medical emergency. So when we were discussing what session we're gonna replace it with, and I saw the title of his session, securing your data with Azure, although his original plan was to talk more about the security in Synapse and data warehouses, I think the topic is something that a lot of people would be interested with. Definitely, it piqued my interest. So instead of replacing it with a different session, we decided to just go with it, and I decided to just present it and go and talk about securing your data with Azure SQL. Now, the presentation you'll be seeing today is based heavily on a module on Azure SQL Fundamentals learning path in learn.microsoft.com. Learn.microsoft.com has a lot of modules and learning path for you to get familiar with Azure. One of the learning path is this one, Azure SQL Fundamentals. This learning path will help you prepare for the DP300 exam if you're planning to take the database administrator certification. This is one of the online learning path free resource that you can take to prepare you for the exam. This will also prepare you for Azure Data Fundamentals exam. So if you see anything during our session that you would like to revisit afterwards, you can, most of the items, if you want to know more, discover more about the resources and the features that we'll be talking, you can head over to learn.microsoft.com and explore the modules. There's how many? One, two, three, four, five, 6 modules for Azure SQL Fundamentals. Tonight we'll be focusing on securing your data, but you can follow along after the session if you want. So for securing your data with Azure SQL, we're gonna break it down into 4 categories. The first one is the platform and network security. We're gonna talk about the features and the capabilities in Azure SQL to help you connect your database to your clients, and how to secure the network on the network side. It's always a running joke with SQL Server DBA that once you're a DBA, you're also a server admin. And now with Azure SQL, it's offloaded because it's a platform as a service. But we still need to understand a little bit about the networking side, so that we can understand how we can secure and how we can connect our databases over the cloud. And then after that, we're gonna talk about identity and access management, authentication, the permissions that you need to be aware of, the roles that you need to be aware of in securing your your SQL database for the authentication, as well as for the stuff and for the actions that you can do on the Azure portal. Then we will move on and talk about the data protection that we have in Azure SQL. We're going to talk about the encryption that you can enable, the encryption that you should be aware of, and the setup that you usually have when you deploy your database in Azure SQL. Then after that, if we still have some time, we're gonna talk about the security management, how you can monitor all this stuff, how you can improve your security, monitor your environment, and how Azure makes it a lot easier to manage all this stuff, from security management to your resources. Yeah, so like I previously said, you can find all these on the Azure SQL Secure Data module. And let's go and talk about network security. So for network security, let's take a look at this example environment. Here we have a database. Now we have this. Let me go back. All right. So for network security, we're gonna talk about it by this example. We have Azure SQL database here, MySQL DB serve database Windows.net, and then let's pretend that you have different clients both in Azure SQL, in Azure, with these 3 VMs, and they are in different network VNet. They're in different regions. And then you also have clients from your on premises. So once you deploy your database on Azure SQL, the easiest way to configure your network is by enabling access to Azure services. What this allows you is it will allow anything on the Azure environment to discover your SQL database. It can, if they have the logins, they will be able to connect to your database. So this will allow easy access for your resources on Azure. This option though doesn't allow you to connect your on-premises client to your SQL databases. Usually you use this if you want to provision something very quick, you want to test, mainly if you want to test something, and all your environment is in Azure. This is the fastest way that you can deploy your database and allow other clients to see it. The downside of this one is, once you allow access to Azure services, it allows access to everything on Azure, in Azure. So even outside your subscription will be able to connect to your database, which is something that you might not want to do. Even for a dev environment, it's something that you might not want to enable if it's a company, if it's a development environment for your company. This is more for easy deployment, for testing, for your POCs. The next thing if you want a more secure way to provision your network, what you do is you create firewall rules. Here you create policies based on IP address or IP address range, so that the client can connect to your SQL database. So with firewall rules, that allows your on-premises to connect to your SQL database. This is one of the most common way to provision your network. The If you have a one or two client, a very easy and secure way to do it. It only becomes a problem, for example, if you have clients that have the dynamic IP, or if you have a lot of clients that need to connect. It's the overhead for managing the policies, because you have to write a policy for each of them, for each of the IP or for each range. The management for it gets a little bit cumbersome. So another way of doing it is by creating network policies for your VNet, for your virtual network. So if you do that, you'll be able to connect everything on this. For example, you have a VNet here, SQL DB VNet dash EUS. That means any server within this VNet will be able to connect to your SQL database, which is the virtual net. The VNet is within your subscription, within your resource group. So that's a secure way of doing it, and it's easier to manage. In terms of for your on premises, you can also do the same thing by using a VNet gateway express route. Now the subnet, the network on your on premise is also paired to your existing virtual network here in Azure, or in to your MySQL database, MySQL DB serve. Then it will allow access from your on-prem to your SQL database. Now, all the network security that we have talked about, they all still go through the public endpoint. Remember, MySQL database is once you create it, it creates a public endpoint. All your transaction goes through the internet, goes to the public endpoint before it goes back to your VNet, your private network. For some security requirements, this might be something that you cannot do for your environment. If that's the case, the newest and the safest way to set up your network security is by using a private link. Once you What a private link does is, what you do with a private link is you create a private endpoint within your virtual network, like here in the private endpoint 10.0.05. Now this endpoint will only be accessible to the VNet that is paired to where it is. So the communication for this endpoint doesn't go out to the internet. It's only within your private network. So once you have a private endpoint, you can disable public access for your SQL database, and your database communication will reside within your private network. It won't go out. So in terms of what's recommended for network security, if you're looking for the most secure way of provisioning your network, that would be private endpoint. We can also look at it this way. Once there's an incoming connection to your database, what it does is it checks first on the policy if it denies public network access or it allows public network access. If public network access is not denied, then it will check for the VNet firewall rules. If the VNet is if there's a policy for the VNet that the connection is coming from, then it will allow your connection to go through and connect to the database. If, for example, there's no VNet policy for your VNet where the call is coming from, it then will check for database level firewall. Now, for SQL database, you can do two types of firewall. One is database level and one is server level. Database level firewall is specific to the database where it's added. So, for example, here the database firewall only allows the IP from the incoming connection to connect to DB1. So that will allow it to connect to DB1, but not specifically to DB2. If there's a policy for DB2 for the same network or for the same IP, then it will allow it. But if not, then you can only connect to the specific database where the firewall rule is. You can also create a server level firewall. So this one is on your logical server. Once there's once the policy is on the server level, it will be able to connect to DB1 and DB2 if it has the proper authentication for it. Now, if the connection is coming from an IP that doesn't match for all of this, then the connection will be denied. Now, like we said earlier, for what if we deny public network access? If you deny public network access, the only way for you to connect is through private endpoint. So let's take a look at the portal so that we can understand more. Let me see. Let me just log on to the portal. Okay, so I have here a logical server SRV or Azure Sql. If you go down to the firewall network, that's where you can see it. You see here, when you provision Azure SQL database, this is one of the parameters. Are you allowing Azure services and resources to access this server? If you set this to no, to yes, then everything on the Azure network can discover your database and they can connect if they have a login for the database. So the recommendation, this may also come out on the DB300 exam. The recommendation is to turn this off when you provision, unless you specifically are just testing or want to leave it on. To make it more secure, you turn this off so that it will only be accessible to the resources that you want it to be to access it. So you can see here this section. This is the firewall rules for the IP. This is let's delete this one. And this section below is where you can see the virtual network. So you can add, if you have an existing VNet on your in your resource group or in your Azure subscription, you can add it here. Now, if there, let's see here. Let's test the access. So let's check first my IP. So this is my IP. My public IP is 132.147.199.119.1. So right now we remove any IP rules, right? Oh, which is, you can also see here in the portal, which is correct. That's my public IP. So we don't have any firewall rules, so we shouldn't be able to connect. So when I refresh this connection, I won't be able to connect. The how can you add if you're on the portal, the quickest way is to do this, add client IP, then it will add your client IP. You can also do the same thing when you log in here. Now, if you have access to the subscription, you can log in, and then it will ask you if you want to add the rule. Now, this will pop if the IP if you use SMS and the IP you're coming from doesn't have any access on the resource. No, if you have permission to the subscription, for example, this account that's it's the owner of the subscription, I'll be able to add. But if you don't have the proper permission or proper role on the subscription, you won't be able to add the IP. You will be prompted with an error. So now I'm connected. If you go back here and refresh, you'll find a new IP policy, IP, a new rule here with the client IP. So that's why it's the easiest way. So when we go here and we check, let me check. Let's connect. If you go here and connect, you can see the IP address that I'm coming from is my IP address 132.147.119.1. So that's how you can provision it. But right now, we're all the connection that we're using is going to the public endpoint. You can verify that. You can see here that deny public network access is disabled because this server doesn't have any private endpoint created yet. So you won't be able to deny public access because that's the only way you can connect. If you look at our server name, if you check if it's up, if you're going to the public endpoint, I'm not sure if it's too small. Let me make it bigger. So if you do an NS lookup with the server name, it will present, since it's a public endpoint, it will give you this information. This one, another aspect of using, another reason to use a private endpoint. Because if you are going to the public endpoint, it will give all the aliases available for the server, the IP address. If you're using a public endpoint, you won't be when you do a lookup for the server name for SRV Azure Sql, the only thing that it will return is the private IP, the 10.10 that's 0.1, for example. But that IP they won't be able to connect since it's a private IP. If you want to see, for example, here, this one this one has a private endpoint that was, if you can see here, you can deny public access to it. If you do that, the only way you can connect to this database, to this logical server, will be through the VNet through the VNet where the public IP is, the private IP is. You can, if you go here, so this is the private IP. So you need to have a VNet peering to the VNet where the private IP, the private endpoint is, so that you can connect to that to that database, to the databases on AADs as SVR SQL. Now, if you go later on, if you end up going back and checking the modules for Azure SQL Fundamentals, there's no labs for creating private endpoint because it involves creating. It's not just the SQL database. You need to provision your VNet. You need to pair the network, and you have to create the network policies for the endpoint. So if later on you want to check out and try and provision a private endpoint, the modules won't have it. But if you are interested, we can set up a different session and we can discuss more about private endpoint. Or if you want to try on your own, you can go to aka.ms// SQL workshops. There's a lot of example there, and there's one example there for provisioning a private endpoint. So for network, to summarize, for network, well, for Azure SQL, if it's possible for you to create a private endpoint and use that, that's the one that you use for a more secure way of connecting your network. If you can deny public network access on the endpoint, that's even much better. That way, all your connection will go through your private endpoint, and it's gonna be more secure. If for some reason it's not possible for you, the next best thing is to turn off your uh, allow access to Azure services, turn it off, and then you can configure firewall rules or virtual network rules. Firewall rules will work, but it's just it's too much. It's not really too much, but it's if you have a lot of clients to connect, it will be cumbersome to maintain. The easier way is you configure network VNet rules for your environment. For Azure SQL managed instance, it's a different. It's kind of a different thing because for MI during provisioning your managed instance, you are already required to create a virtual network, a separate subnet for your managed instance. So the way that you can configure network security for your MI is to use virtual network rules. So that's the only difference because for MI, that's one of its features, and that's one of its selling point that you have that your SQL server is on a separate private VNet for itself. And as always, you need to work with your network admin. You need to work with your internal you need to work with your internal people so that you can find out the policies, the correct standards for your network. Because some different organizations have different standard. So make sure you work with your network admins so that you can follow the best practice for your environment. Now, that's for network. Uh, do we have any questions? If you have any questions during my presentation, feel free to drop them on the chat. And when it's when it's a logical break for the presentation, we can check it and we can answer the questions. So since there's no questions right now on the chat, I'm gonna proceed and go to identity and access management. Now, for access management, there's two category. The roles are separated between your authentication on your SQL server, on your Azure SQL, and for the stuff that you can do on the portal. So Azure role-based access control, or RBAC, refers to the operations for the activities that you do on the Azure level, on the portal level. For these permissions, these roles will apply to things that you can do on the Azure portal or using the Azure CLI or PowerShell. These are permissions for provisioning the resources depending on where the scope is, if it's on the subscription level or on the resource group level or specific resources. So it's separated from the security in Azure SQL itself. So even if you have RBAC roles uh, on your Azure login, it doesn't mean that you have access on the database itself, because the security and the authentication on the database side is separate from the role for the RBAC. The RBAC is more on, it has four roles right now: SQL DB contributor, SQL MI contributor, SQL security manager, and SQL server contributor. Uh, for example, SQL DB contributor allows you to create databases.